Welcome, everyone. My name is Tim Grant. I'm the host for this evening's webinar, and along with me here is Bora Simmons, our presenter for this evening. Bora, I'm going to ask you a leading question. How's the weather out in Oregon right?
The weather is absolutely perfect. We've got about 80 degrees and nice blue skies. So a wonderful end of September.
Fantastic. Lucky you. And the reason why I say it was a leading question was that 2 nights ago we had our presenter lost. There was a big storm in the St. Louis area, and he not only lost power at his house for a few minutes, but when it came back on, lost the internet connectivity, and nothing he could do would restore it. So he threw his laptop in his car and drove through a lightning storm for 20 minutes to get to the nature center where he worked. And cool as a cucumber, he delivered a wonderful presentation and answered all our questions. But 3 times he had to get up in the midst of that presentation, interrupting himself to go to the weather alarms that kept ringing in his nature center. It was quite a performance. So I was glad to hear that things are nice and calm in Oregon, and hopefully we'll do fine here this evening. Everyone, thanks again for joining us wherever you are from, and we'll get to that in a moment. But for those of you who are new to these webinars, and I see we have a few people whose names I recognize who've been participated in earlier webinars this week. But for those who haven't, let me give you a quick sense of where we're going over the next hour. Our presenter, Bora Simmons, will present for up to 30 minutes, and then the second 30 minutes will be for you to ask questions of her. But you don't have to wait 30 minutes to do that. If you have any comments, questions, or technical difficulties you want to alert me to, the place where you can comment or ask questions much earlier is in the chat box in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen. And the way to add a comment is if you see where it says main room in the extreme bottom corner, and then look to the horizontal blank box to the right, if you type into that empty box and then hit enter on your keyboard, that will propel your comment up into the chat box for everyone to see. So I'd encourage you to take advantage of that. If there are technical difficulties or questions I can answer during Bora's presentation, I will do my best, and also ensure that if you have a question for Bora Simmons that you've put into the chat box, that I'll make sure that gets relayed to her. Meanwhile, if you're not familiar, as I mentioned earlier, we've had a couple of other webinars this week. We're starting a fall series, and if you're not familiar with Green Teacher, we have our non-profit magazine that's been publishing for 20 years, providing youth educators with innovative learning strategies in their work with elementary, middle, and high school kids, and working with those who work with kids outside of schools. And then the last 10 years, we've had the pleasure, Bora, if you can just advance that slide, of publishing these books. And if you're not familiar with our nonprofit magazine and books, I'd certainly encourage you and you find this I should also say, if you find this webinar worthwhile and you're not familiar with Green Teacher, please consider taking out a subscription or buying a book so we can continue to offer this free series of webinars. Okay, as you heard a moment ago, this presentation is being archived, so you can you can tell your friends that they can, and you yourself can freely view it for the next month. So don't feel compelled to take notes. And at the end, at the 60-minute mark, I will ask your indulgence to fill out a very quick survey that takes 1 or 2 minutes, and those of you who do so, as an incentive, will have an opportunity to win one of 2 free 1-year digital subscriptions to Green Teacher magazine. Okay, well, without further ado, let me introduce Bora Simmons. Let me tell you the formal stuff first. She's the founding director of the National Project for Excellence in Environmental Education. This project was initiated in 1993 by the North American Association for Environmental Education, otherwise known as NAAEE. and it was developed to help educators deliver effective environmental ed programs. After 20 years as a professor of environmental ed at Northern Illinois University, Bora retired in 2007 a project to the Institute for a Sustainable Environment at the University of Oregon. She's been actively involved in environmental education research, evaluation, and professional development for over 30 years. She served on the NAAA Board of Directors as its president and currently serves on numerous steering committees and boards of directors, including National Project Learning Tree, the Education Operating Committee, and the Environmental Education and Conservation Global. I would add informally that there are a few people who have contributed more to environmental education in the last 30 years than Bora Simmons. She's one of those quiet champions who develops wonderful collaborations with an enormous number of people, rarely takes credit, and yet advances the agenda of environmental education in fundamental ways. And I'm so delighted, Bora, that you accepted this invitation, and to all who've joined the webinar so far, you're in for a real treat. Bora, a hearty welcome to you.
Thank you so much, Tim. As Tim mentioned, this is the National Project for Excellence in Environmental Education is an initiative of the North American Association for Environmental Education. And to get us started, and Tim gave you some directions of how to enter the chat function, we just want to throw out a quick question for you. So if you could type in, where are you from? And give us some indication of your familiarity with the Guidelines for Excellence, or if you are quite familiar with them and have used them, how you have used them. And so as you type those in and we get a sense of who you are, where you're from, what I wanted to tell you was basically what this whole presentation is about, is this notion of the Guidelines for Excellence and the 5 publications that we've produced as part of the National Project for Excellence in Environmental Education. And we've done this over a number of years, about the last 15 or so years. And what I'm going to try to do in the time that we have remaining is to just give you a really brief overview of the 5 documents and a little bit about how they've been used, and then tell you how you can get access to them as we move on. So let me find where I am on my slides here. There we go. One of the things that is probably a bit unique with the Guidelines for Excellence documents is that they have all been produced through a public participatory process. So they are not, they really are a reflection of what I like to refer to as our collective wisdom as a field. That it's, we've had research behind them. We have a wonderful writing team for each one of the documents and the writing team tends to reflect people from different aspects of environmental education, different perspectives on environmental education, the various hats that each one of us wears as an environmental educator. But it's not just the wisdom of the writing team. It's also the wisdom of practitioners and researchers in the field of environmental education. Because what we've done is that we do research on a particular topic, then we gather together this writing team. They brainstorm a draft outline, a really initial notion that might only be 1 page long. And then we've always sent that out to the environmental educators who were interested in responding, interested in giving us feedback. And then basically we took their feedback, we revised, sent it back out again, revised, sent it back out again. And through that process, we've literally had thousands of individuals and organizations participate in the process. So the development of the guidelines themselves, the documents, that's an important product of the project. But it's also, I think, two other really important pieces. One is that we're really trying to engage educators throughout North America in a truly deep discussion about what it means to produce quality environmental education materials, to implement quality environmental education programs. So how do we improve our practice as environmental educators? And so through that process, we've really been trying to build our profession. So I'm going to keep this part a little bit short since we've gone and taken so long with whatever technical difficulties I had. But I'd like to, through the chat box, get a bit of your thoughts about environmental education, and particularly ask you the question of what are some of the essential underpinnings or key ideas that are foundational for environmental education from your perspective. So if you don't mind taking a moment to put those ideas into the chat box, that would be great. And so it's really, what are some of the things that come to mind? One or two of those key foundational ideas about environmental education. And what I'll share with you as you're typing those in and thinking about it is some of the ideas that have come out through the development of the guidelines and that public participatory process. One of the essential underpinnings, as we call it, is the whole notion of systems, and that it's important for us to understand the systems of the earth, but it's also equally important that we help people develop systems thinking skills. Another incredibly important underpinning is this notion of interdependence, that we as humans are bound to our environmental quality, that we are impacted by environmental quality, and we impact environmental quality. So that interdependence is a huge piece of environmental education. Another important idea is this idea of the importance of where one lives, that we begin environmental education close to home. We're hoping that our learners, the people that we work with, are forging connections with their local environment, that they're able to explore the local environment and understand it. And then as they continue on in their explorations, they move out into wider and wider circles and larger systems. The notion of integration and infusion is really mostly geared towards formal education and the idea that we have these disciplines of science and social studies and the humanities, but that environmental education is something that cuts across those disciplines, and that we're hoping that it's infused or integrated across the disciplines and pull from the really important pieces of all of our disciplines. Then another important underpinning is this notion of being rooted in the real world, that learning takes place in the real world, that it's experiential, that the learners are developing their knowledge and skills through direct experiences with the environment, direct experiences with environmental issues and with society. And then finally, the notion of lifelong learning, that we're hoping that we're developing critical and creative thinking skills, skills for decision making, and communication and collaborative learning, and that all of those pieces are emphasized as we develop and implement our environmental education programs. So to begin, I want to tell you a little bit about the very first set of guidelines that we developed, Environmental Education Materials Guidelines for Excellence. And the whole purpose behind this set of guidelines was to think about our instructional materials. So to think about those activity guides that we create and the activity guides that we use in our programs, and to try to describe what are the key characteristics of good quality instructional materials for environmental education. And what this next slide sort of basically shows is just a snapshot of a typical page in this set of guidelines, and how they're formatted, in essence, is that there are 6 key characteristics. The first one happens to be fairness and accuracy, and it lays out a series of guidelines. So you'll notice that it says fairness and accuracy, and then down on the left-hand side, right below the bird, it says factual accuracy. So that's what we call a guideline. So each one of these sets of guidelines, the documents, are developed in a similar way and formatted in a similar way, in that we have big ideas, key characteristics, and then a series of guidelines that help describe that key characteristic, and then the bullet points that fall underneath that give you a little bit more hint. They're indicators that you might be meeting those particular guidelines. So for the material guidelines, what we're looking at in terms of key characteristics are things like fairness and accuracy, the importance of the information that you're presenting, and making sure that you have balanced presentations of the differing viewpoints and openness to inquiry, things like that. But also a key characteristic has to do with depth and the notion of developing deep concepts and conceptual understandings about the information that you're trying to involve the learner with. That there's an emphasis on building skills, creative thinking skills, critical thinking skills, and that we're applying those skills to issues. There's also an important piece to our materials, our instructional materials, about trying to encourage that we're promoting civic responsibility and encouraging learners to use their own knowledge and personal skills and assessments of environmental problems and issues as a basis for problem solving. And also this set of guidelines gets into just sort of the nitty-gritty of good quality environmental education materials. So how well you have laid out the goals and objectives, assessment opportunities, are they easy to use, things like that. Now I just wanted to give you a little hint of some of the ways that these guidelines have been used. They've certainly been used in the development of curricular materials by groups like World Wildlife and Audubon Society, Project Learning Tree, Project WET, Project WILD. And currently, the city of Denver is working collaboratively with EarthForce and the Denver Public Schools and the Denver Public Works Department in developing an environmental education program that links children and their schools to nearby parks and to public works. And they're developing a curriculum that goes along with that, and they're using this set of guidelines in that process. There's also another use of the guidelines, which I always get a bit of a kick out of, is that Johnson Controls, that, and it's a corporation that does work on large-scale buildings, things like the Empire State Building. They design a lot of the environmental engineering, building engineering. They've actually used the materials guidelines to design some of their employee training programs. So it's just kind of an interesting thing of how different groups have used the guidelines. The second set of guidelines we developed have to do with learning and have to do with environmental literacy and trying to set forward a framework for environmental literacy at the K through 12 age range. This set of guidelines basically lays out what it means to be environmentally literate. What is it that a person should know and be able to do if they're on their way towards environmental literacy? It's benchmarked at what are grade levels in the United States of 4th grade, 8th grade, and 12th grade. So at about the end of when somebody's about 10 years old, it lays out what we would hope that they would know and be able to do if they're moving towards environmental literacy, and then at 14-year-old and 18 years old. These are set out in a very similar way to the other sets of guidelines. They're divided into what we call strands. Again, really big ideas towards environmental literacy. So things like Strand 1 has to do with the development of a solid set of inquiry skills. So questioning skills, analysis and interpretation skills. Strand 2, and you have just a snapshot of it on the screen there, has to do with the knowledge that we would hope people are gaining about environmental processes and systems. So the Earth is a physical system, the living environment, and human systems. So we're concerned about our cultural systems, our understanding social systems, political, economic systems, and how those relate to the environment. In Strand 3, we revisit again a set of skills, but in this case, we're looking at skills for understanding and addressing environmental issues, including decision-making skills and citizenship skills. And then the fourth strand gets us into personal and civic responsibility. This set of guidelines is really, they were originally designed primarily for the K-12 formal school system, although they are being used very much within non-formal education as just a way of thinking about and breaking down the component parts of environmental literacy. But certainly within the United States, one of the major challenges for us as educators is fitting within a standards-based curriculum in the schools. So one of the things that we've been trying to do within the project is to help educators look at environmental literacy and see how it meshes with or how it supports the standards-based curriculum. So this screenshot here was something that our good friends at the Kentucky Environmental Education Council developed for the field, of basically looking at the guidelines and showing how they connect with something called the Common Core Standards for English Language Arts and the Common Core Standards for Mathematics, which have been adopted by about 46 of the states plus the District of Columbia. So we're trying to develop these tools that show how environmental education and environmental literacy in particular meshes within the standards-based curriculum. And this is just another example. In the United States, we're in the midst of developing what are called the next generation science standards. And Scott Carley from the College of Exploration created this graphic to show how different efforts out there, including the guidelines and the four strands, feed into or support the next generation science standards, or certainly at least the framework that's been developed. And my final example is just a current use of the K-12 guidelines. The University of Texas at El Paso has a grant and is working in partnership with the El Paso Independent School District to develop 10 environmental education units that are focusing on air quality issues and environmental justice issues. And they're using the guidelines as their part of their framework in developing these 10 units that are going to be field tested, I believe, this next year, and eventually when they're rolled out, they'll be reaching 50,000 children every year. And now I want to move on just quickly to the third set of guidelines that we've developed in this process. The first set had to do with our instructional materials. The second set had to do with thinking about environmental literacy and what that means. And this third set really gets to the notion of thinking about, well, what is it that environmental educators should know and be able to do? What are the types of competencies that we should have as environmental educators? So this set of guidelines is really geared towards the preparation of environmental educators, whether they're the classroom teachers or somebody who eventually is going to work at a zoo or at a museum or a nature center, but also the professional development. So knowing that once we get out into the field, that we really don't know everything as much as we might want to wish or think that we know everything. And so we do need to continually improve our practice. So this set of guidelines really is trying to describe some of those key characteristics of a well-qualified environmental educator. And what they do is they look at things like environmental literacy, the foundations of environmental education, our professional responsibilities, our ability to plan and implement environmental education programs. So things like that. This set of guidelines is being used in a couple of different ways. One is that a number of states in the United States have basically adopted them, picked them up, and what they're doing is they're developing certification programs. So it's a professional certification that someone who lives in Colorado or Utah or Texas can get as an environmental educator. And there are a number of states that are in the process of developing certification programs. We've also used this set of guidelines to develop two other sort of recognition programs that are out there geared towards primarily teachers and the preparation of teachers. In the United States, there's something called NCATE, and the important part about NCATE is that they accredit somewhere around 60 to 70% of the teacher preparation institutions, colleges and universities in the United States. And so what we've done is we've developed a set of standards that can be used in that accreditation process. And those standards were developed using the guidelines as the foundation. And NAAE is currently in the process of developing a certificate of distinction for environmental education programs at the college and university level. And we're hoping to have a draft of those available sometime in 2013. They would probably, because we're still in draft phase, we're not absolutely sure, but they probably apply to both teacher education programs as well as non-formal environmental education programs. The fourth and final set of guidelines that we've developed thus far has to do with non-formal environmental education programs. And basically what it does, it lays out the steps of developing an environmental education program. So starting with a needs assessment and moving on through thinking about the mission of your organization and thinking about the scope of the program and going all the way through to evaluation. And what I always love about this particular graphic that's in the guidelines is that it says finish and start again, because that's the typical program development cycle, is that we just keep moving around and trying to better our programs. We learn from our evaluation and we improve what we do. One of the things that we've used this the set of guidelines for is to help groups think about their particular programs and do a self-assessment and then create basically a strategic plan to improve their program planning process. And the final set of guidelines that we've developed up to this point has to do with early childhood environmental education. These were published in the year 2010. Early childhood education in this particular set of guidelines basically looks at ages about 3 to 6 years old, and they lay out some of the types of things that you probably would consider typical of thinking about your program philosophy and purpose, thinking about culturally appropriate practice, health and safety, developmentally appropriate practices, especially for those very young learners, play and exploration and getting kids out into nature, thinking about what types of learning opportunities you want to provide for those young learners out in nature, and how to bring nature back into the classroom. So this set of guidelines, just a snapshot of it, again, in the same type of format of having key characteristics and guidelines and indicators. One of the things that has happened as an offshoot of this particular set of guidelines is that we've now developed a rating scale. And the notion behind this rating scale is that people at an early childhood center could sit down, so the staff, the parents, community members, administration could sit down with the guidelines and the rating scale and have some discussions about what they're doing, how well they're doing it, and how they want to improve. And then coming up with a 3-year plan for improvement. This document was only published within the last year, and it's kind of exciting because we have a center down in Florida that went through this process, and in thinking seriously and having these sorts of discussions across all of the stakeholders at their preschool, they actually changed the philosophy statement for their school, and they added a component explicitly about the environment. So I wanted to give you just one more example of how the guidelines have been used. It's kind of a fun one. UC, the Utah Society for Environmental Education, it's the membership organization for the state of Utah. They recently went through a strategic planning process, and in that strategic planning process, they've rethought of their vision and mission, and they came up with a number of different elements that they wanted to work on as an organization. And as this graphic sort of shows you, they saw the guidelines as, for excellence as kind of an umbrella for everything that they do, that it's a touchstone for them when they develop programs, when they work with activities, when they do their professional development for their members. They're looking back at the guidelines throughout that work. So this has been just a really quick overview, and I know that we're running short on time because of our technical difficulties, but I wanted to tell you that if you wanted to learn more about the guidelines, we do offer workshops throughout North America, and we have a set of wonderful facilitators who are able to travel and provide workshops. We also have a website presence up on something called EE Linked, and I'll give you this URL one more time. I just want to step you through it quickly. Up on EE Linked, you'd be able to read more about each of the set of guidelines, and as you'll notice on this screen on the right-hand side of it, it tells you that there are PDFs available. So you can download each of the sets of guidelines for free, as well as other information. So there may be things like that self-assessment tool is available up online. The rating scale for the early childhood guidelines is up available online, and you can download it for free. And if any of you work with Spanish language audiences, both the materials guidelines and the non-formal environmental education guidelines are available in Spanish. And again, you can just go up to eelinked.naae.net/n/guidelines, and you can download those. I gave you the overview of the 5 sets of guidelines that we've already developed. We are in a very beginning phase of developing a 6th set of guidelines that's going to focus on community environmental education. Akima Price is helping us head that process up. So if you would like to become involved, give her a shout out, email her, and we should be putting out the very first draft, just a really initial draft, sometime within probably about the next 3 to 4 weeks. So you would have an opportunity to provide some input into the development of this brand new set of guidelines. If you want to know more about that process, email Akima or email me. We'll also have announcements out through EE News, which is published by NAAEE. And I think with that, maybe we have a little bit of time left over for some questions.
We do indeed, Bora, and thank you very, very much. That was excellent. And by the way, we will, well, let me just get to the slide here first to give you a chance to be the first person to ask a question of Bora. As you can see, there's a blank space there for you to type in a question and then hit the submit button. And if you have a second question, then you'll be returned after you hit the submit button to a blank screen, and you can type that second question in. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice, and hit submit again. So please take advantage of that. And I was going to say a moment ago, Bora, that we will tomorrow send out a follow-up email to everybody who registered for this evening's webinar or this afternoon's webinar, depending on where you are. And we'll include not only the URL for the guidelines, but also Akima Price's email as well, and so that those who didn't catch that, her email address will have that and can contact her if they'd like to help with the community environmental ed guidelines. So, excuse me, without further ado, please add the type in those questions, hit the submit button, and I will retrieve them from the back office and relay them verbally to Bora, and we'll stay as long as we need to answer all your questions. Neither of us are in a rush, and so feel free to ask any and all questions you can think of about the use of these guidelines. Feel free to be specific about your own situation and how, and any questions you have about how the guidelines might be put into practice to guide the work you do in education. whether you're in a classroom or doing an interpretive center, as Crystal Thurber is, and as the last person to comment in the chat box, working in an interpretive program at a state park, obviously with very different situations, one to the next. So feel free to be specific about that in your question to Bora. And Bora, give you a chance to sort of scroll a little bit through the chat box and see some of the comments that you elicited through your excellent questions.
Yeah, it's exciting to see. Perhaps while people are thinking about their questions, I can give a little plug that the NAAEE conference is in Oakland week after next, and we're doing a number of sessions around the guidelines at the conference, including a 4-hour workshop on October 10th that's going to focus on the early childhood guidelines. And what's really fun about that particular workshop is that it focuses on the guidelines, but within the context of doing a number of hands-on early childhood activities. And so you get to walk away with the guidelines, you get to walk away with an activity guide that is geared towards early childhood environmental education produced by Project Learning Tree, as well as get a chance to be introduced to some international activities. So there's all sorts of good stuff going on out there, besides the fact that it's a wonderful conference.
It is indeed. It's astonishing how rich each of those NAAA conferences are. I think next year it's in Baltimore, and the following year coming up here to Ottawa, Canada's capital. So if you can't make it to Oakland in a couple of weeks, think Baltimore and Ottawa over the next 2 years. I'm going to check and see if there's any questions. I'm having a little trouble myself now accessing the back office, so hopefully I can solve it.
And while Tim is looking for the questions, it looks like Crystal Thurber asked a question about how to access copies of the guidelines. And so I can fill that in right now, is that you have an opportunity to be able to download them for free. They're all in PDF. And literally you can download from the cover all the way through to the back cover. And that is up on EE Linked. And so it's just, I think Tim will be sending out that email with the URL. But you can go up there and you can download them. You can purchase them. So if you don't particularly like a PDF and you really like, you're old-fashioned and like the hardcover copy, or actually it's a soft cover, you can purchase them through NAAEE. So just go up to naaee.net/publications, and you can order any one of them or the complete set through NAAEE. We also, when we offer workshops, because we have the funding through EPA right now, is that we're able to provide the books for free for those workshops.
Great, thank you, Bora. I'm actually having trouble. I'm still having trouble with the back office, but I did a moment ago use a separate way on the screen, which of course has changed the screen that I see now, to take away the question. But there were no questions in the back office, and if you have any questions, folks, and that may or may not be true, but if you have questions and you've already typed them into that box and hit submit, it actually would be helpful to both Bora and myself if you could retype them into the chat box, and that way we'll be sure, everyone will be sure to see them, and we can get your question answered right away. So with that, if indeed you've already typed them in, I'm just not able to see them in the for some reason, and I'm not sure why. It may be that there's no questions, but I kind of doubt that. So if you retype them into the chat box, I'd be very appreciative. And Bora, I've got a quick question. How many years has it been since someone got the idea to do these guidelines?
Well, actually, we're at 19 years now. So in 1993, the board of directors of NAAEE basically was trying to chew on the issue of education reform and how environmental education and how our organization was going to engage the issues around education reform. And so in 1993, there was one of those classic, absolutely, I was on the board of directors at the time, and it was an absolutely classic situation where we had a wonderful discussion, and then somebody made a motion, and the motion was, we should do something. We should try to engage education reform. And in essence, in the motion, it was geared towards the executive director of the organization, Ed McCrae, at the time. And so it was sort of like, go off, Ed, staff, you should do something. And so, it was classic. He was overwhelmed and probably underpaid. And the board was giving him one more task to do. Well, it turned out that I was going on sabbatical the next semester, so the spring term of 1994, and he gave me a call and said, basically asked me, if I was willing to try to start to think about what it might mean for NAAEE to engage education reform. And so my department chair was very nice in allowing me to alter my sabbatical project a little bit. And what I did was develop a series of sort of policy briefs that said, well, here are some of the areas where we might want to think about trying to develop some strategies. We didn't call them guidelines at that time. We were just trying to lay out that, well, we probably needed to address something about the quality of environmental education instructional materials, and we needed to think in terms of student standards because that was such a big thing within the United States at that time, and then professional development and actually, I think those were the only three that we thought of at the moment. And I kind of laid out a strategy and a structure for doing that. And so the board that following year, so the fall of 1994, basically said that, yes, we should pursue this. And this project was born at that point.
Excellent. Okay. Well, thank you for taking us back through that history too. And it's again, as I said in my introduction, there are really few projects that have had such an enormous impact. And the fact that half of those on the webinar this evening were familiar with it, some had read quite a lot, and I know that I myself have been in touch with literally hundreds of educators across the U.S. and Canada and beyond who have used the guidelines, who've made good use of them to both improve their own practices, but also to defend their work with administrators who perhaps could care less, who did think that the work they're doing had educational credibility. They were able to waive a copy of the guidelines, throw them onto the desk of those administrators, and therefore turn the tables a little bit. And so they've really brought enormous credibility to the field of environmental ed. And I really salute you for taking on that leadership challenge when Ed McRae tossed it to you low these many years ago. I think we don't have any questions coming in, and I think so I'm going to suggest that we turn now to the final questionnaire at the end of, as I mentioned earlier, I'll ask all of you to indulge for a minute or two to fill out this questionnaire about the session, and apologies again at our end for the technical difficulties we had, but I think you'll agree it was a wonderful session in the end here. So I'll change the screen and bring up this questionnaire, and those of you who stay for a moment or two to complete it will have access. Your names will be entered to win one of 2 free digital 1-year subscriptions to Green Teacher. So just hold on here. Great, and you can scroll down like the other screen a moment ago. This has 5 questions. 3 of them are multiple choice. You can ignore the typo in the last choice of the first question on the screen, but as you scroll down through the 5, you'll see a submit button, and I thank you in advance for taking the time to respond to these questions, and again, thank you for hanging in for a little longer than we normally go, because indeed, I think it was well worth it. And thank you for this. I thought it was a really good summary, Bora, of really 19 years of enormous collaborative work. It sounds like probably several hundred people worked on these guidelines, and probably with all the comments you received, it's possible to say more than 1,000 people did so.
Yeah, we know just from keeping track of things over the years that just as an example for the learner guidelines, those K-12 guidelines, we had participation by over 2,500 individuals and groups, organizations. So sometimes a group would combine comments from 10, 15, 20 people and submit them to us. So yes, there's literally been thousands of people involved in the process over the years.
Fantastic, that's great. And you're saying that the community environmental education guidelines are just now being worked on? Is there the draft that's going to come out in a few weeks? Is that it?
Yes, there'll be a draft. We're going to actually have a session at the NAAE conference, an input session at the conference, but we'll also be posting them on the web, and people will be able to provide input. And then we're hoping, we're planning on having at least 3 opportunities for people to provide input over the next maybe 9 months or so.
Fantastic. At critical junctures, do send me an email to that effect, and we'll put it in the announcement section of Green Teacher. Encourage people to jump in and make those kinds of comments. So, well, that's great. And are there future guidelines in the works, or more translation?
We're not absolutely sure. There's been some talk about a set of guidelines that might focus on green schools, and there's been some talk about the notion of a set of guidelines focusing on urban environmental education. But those, it's still in the talk phase, and that horrible subject of funding comes up. We have to figure out how we're going to fund the process. But those are 2 that there's at least been some initial discussion.
I can imagine. No, that would be great. Okay. Well, again, Bora, I can't thank you enough. I really appreciate your persistence in the face of the technical difficulties. And who knows what happened, but it's WIMBA. It could be WIMBA. It could be yours, and who knows. But I know often enough it's here at in the WIMBA classroom that somehow things just don't quite click, or you're fine. You and I were fine in the preparation, half hour before the start, and then all of a sudden, as soon as you start turning those slides, and as I don't know if you heard, but I did mention that there was another person, and I was her fault, but I noticed that the orange light was starting to come on beside her name, and it was just at that moment you lost sound. So it was as if someone else appropriated it, and probably unintentionally. So, okay, if you can hit the archive button, we'll wrap this up.